Welcome to the Neuro Lifestyle Podcast, the show where we help you turn every aspect of your lifestyle into an advantage for your brain and your mind. Learn how to upgrade your fitness, food, technology, mindset, and more to unleash your full potential for life. Welcome to the Neuro Lifestyle Podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Brady Salcido. And before we get going on this episode, make sure you head over to the neurolifestyle.com/giveaway, because guess what? We're giving away free brain boosting products every single month to our loyal subscribers. It takes less than a minute to enter. And once you are entered, you are always entered to win for the whole next year. So you get 12 opportunities to win. So make sure you head over to the neurolifestyle.com/giveaway and get entered to win. So now on to this episode. I'm really excited about this episode because in this episode, we're going to be talking about a topic that I'm very fascinated in, and that's called neurogenesis. Now, if you're new to neurogenesis is the ability of your brain to produce new brain cells. And what's really fascinating about this is that actually roughly 60% of new brain stem cells, when they're formed, which are the premature brain cells, once they're formed, actually get pruned off. So the brain has this biological process that prunes off a lot of these extra brain cells. So what we'll be talking about in this episode is what can you do to increase your rate of neurogenesis, but also what can you do to preserve those new brain cells that are being formed and also avoid those things that actually reduce your rate of neurogenesis. So I can think of nobody better for this podcast than Dr. Brant Cortright. He is the author of the Neurogenesis Diet and Lifestyle. What I really love about this conversation is it's just pure content. There's no fluff in this. We're just going to get right down to the nuts and bolts of what do you need to do for your diet? What do you need to do for movement and fitness? What do you need to start adding in terms of supplements? What do you need to do for mindset? Really fascinating topic of conversation because it really addresses the whole complete lifestyle regimen that you need to start implementing to increase your rate of neurogenesis. But he also goes into what do we need to avoid to make sure we're keeping our rate of neurogenesis high, but also increasing levels of a protein called BDNF. And BDNF helps preserve those brain cells and actually preserves those new neurons that are being formed. So really interesting conversation, really excited for this one. So without further ado, here is Dr. Brant Cortright. How you doing today?
I'm doing well. Thank you for having me.
Good. Well, I'm so excited for our interview today. But for those who haven't heard of you before, haven't read your book, tell us a little bit more about who you are and what brought you to where you are today.
Okay. Well, I'm a psychologist and a psychology professor at a graduate school in San Francisco. And I've been working in the field of really consciousness and sort of becoming our fullest self for a few decades. And I've recently become aware that I think I've actually underestimated the role of the brain in the process of living and consciousness and healing and growth. And that really led me to this book, to really see how the state of our brain determines the state of our consciousness and really the quality of our life. That a low quality brain means a life of struggle, of depression, of stress, of anxiety, of cognitive decline, even lowered immunity. And a really high functioning brain means the opposite, that we're doing really well. So this is really a holistic approach to brain health, meaning every level of our consciousness gets channeled through our brain. So body, the physical level, emotions, the heart level, the mind, intellectual, and spirit. Spiritual experiences also come through the brain. So body, heart, mind, spirit. And it turns out when we activate all of these together, they work synergistically and work to support and stimulate the brain to operate at a higher level. And the key to this is really a process called neurogenesis. And neurogenesis is the process of making new brain cells. So it used to be thought, in fact, it was considered gospel up until just very recently, the brain stopped growing new brain cells after we were in our early 20s or so. And then it was just a slow die-off after that. But then it was discovered that actually we make new brain cells throughout our entire life. And this process of neurogenesis, the generation of new neurons, has a huge impact on the quality of our brain and the quality of our life. So for a long time, they didn't understand the significance that we now make new brain cells throughout our lifetime. So it turns out that the rate of neurogenesis is hugely important. It's the most important biomarker for brain health that most people have never heard of. So a low rate of neurogenesis is associated with cognitive decline, with memory problems, with reduced creativity, with anxiety, stress, depression. And a high rate of neurogenesis is associated with the opposite, with cognitive enhancement, with rapid learning, and with protection against stress, anxiety, and depression. So the book, really, it's the Neurogenesis Diet and Lifestyle. It's about how to increase our rate of neurogenesis.
Very cool. Very cool. And for those who maybe haven't heard of neurogenesis before, address, a little bit more of this idea that I think some people have probably heard, once you kill off brain cells, you can't regrow them. Now, is that true or not true?
Well, in certain parts of the brain, that is true. But there are other parts of the brain that are continually growing new brain cells. And one of the major system is called the hippocampus. And the hippocampus is an incredible part of the brain because it connects to all parts of who we are. So it's actually a kind of crescent moon-shaped structure. And part of it connects to memories and the cognitive portion of the brain. And the hippocampus processes new memories. So in Alzheimer's, for example, that massively attacks the hippocampus. And there we get an inability to form new memories. And so when our capacity to make new memories goes, it's like it pulls out the rug from the whole sense of self. And you can see people have Alzheimer's. It's like their whole sense of self is just kind of slipping. So it's extremely important for most of what we think of as our human capacities. Our capacity to plan ahead, memory, executive function. This is all, we really need a well-functioning hippocampus for this. Emotion regulation, hugely important. The other part of the hippocampus goes into parts of the body awareness, spatial relations, and also emotion regulation. So this structure can regrow, and in fact, it looks like most people can increase their rate of neurogenesis by 5 times with really quite profound effects in their quality of life. We live in such a neurotoxic world. There are so many things in the environment, in our diet, in relationships, that actually slow down our rate of neurogenesis. So this is really a 2-pronged strategy. We want to decrease those things that lower neurogenesis, and we want to increase those things that accelerate neurogenesis. So, for example, some people with PTSD have about 3/4 the size of a hippocampus as normal people. That's huge. That's really massive. That sets them up for all kinds of emotional difficulties, for ongoing stress, for ongoing depression, for ongoing cognitive problems. PTSD, for some people, is also a brain problem. And so if you can regrow the hippocampus, which you can, this has huge implications for things like PTSD as well as just Alzheimer's, many other things as well.
Yeah, wow, that's fascinating. Wow, I've never heard that before. 3/4 of the size. Wow.
Yeah. That's like saying your heart. It's like you only have 3 out of 4 chambers. I mean, that's huge.
Yeah, for sure. Now you talk about a couple different categories in your book, and one of those first ones that you talk about is food. So let's kind of address food. What are some of those things that are toxic in terms of neurogenesis, in terms of what we eat?
Yeah, good. Because there's a chapter in the book on the body, chapter on the heart, chapter on the mind, chapter on spirit, and just different ways we can increase neurogenesis. But there's a whole chapter on diet because diet is hugely important. If we want to build a beautiful high-end house, we can't use rotting lumber or decaying wood. We've got to use really high-quality materials. And it's the same with our brain. If we want a high-quality brain, we need to make sure that we are nourishing it with the highest quality nutrients possible. So it turns out that about 60% of the brain is made out of fat. So the first thing we want to do is make sure we're getting plenty of good quality fats. The second thing we want to do is make sure we're not getting too many carbohydrates or sugar. A high sugar diet will cut your rate of neurogenesis in 2. That's pretty astonishing. I mean, when you think about the average American diet, or like the average kid who starts off with, Rice Krispies or sugar frosted flakes and orange juice, it's all sugar. And bad fats. There's no way you can grow a good brain like that. So we want to make sure that we've got good, healthy fats, meaning non-oxidized fats. And the most important of these are omega-3s. So omega-3s we think of as associated with fish oil, particularly from cold water fish, like Alaskan wild-caught salmon. So of the 60% of the brain that's fat, 1/3 of that is DHA. And DHA is one of the 3 omega-3 fatty acids. So omega-3 consists of ALA, EPA, and DHA. And DHA is by far the most important. They did a study with monkeys where they raised one group of monkeys on a low omega-3 diet and another group on a high omega-3 diet. And they looked at their brains. And the brains of the low omega-3 monkeys were very simple, very non-differentiated brains. But the brains of the high omega-3 monkeys were very complex, richly differentiated brains, almost like humans. We want to make sure that we've got a lot of good omega-3s throughout our entire life, particularly in childhood, but throughout the entire lifespan. So most people should be getting about, 1 gram to 1.5 grams of DHA, which means probably 3 to 4 to 5 grams of omega-3 every day. And the way to get this for most people, since it's hard to eat enough wild-caught salmon to do that, is through a supplement. If you take it as a supplement, you need to make sure to get a molecularly distilled form of omega-3, because fish oil tends to concentrate mercury. And mercury is one of the most potent neurotoxins known. I think it's second only to plutonium in terms of its toxic effects on the brain. So if it's molecularly distilled, it won't have any mercury in it. It won't have any bad stuff in it. So you can increase your rate of neurogenesis by 40% just by adding omega-3 to your diet. The other thing we want is lots of good, healthy fats. So saturated fats, we want at least 10, 15%. Animal-based protein and fats are good. So we also want monounsaturated fats, and we want to stay away from vegetable oils because those oxidize really quickly. And oxidized fats in the bloodstream oxidize the cholesterol in your bloodstream. And that creates heart disease, atherosclerosis. It creates inflammation. And inflammation is another neurotoxin. The brain is exquisitely sensitive to the level of inflammation in the body. And so if we have an anti-inflammatory diet, that's going to be really helpful. High levels of inflammation slow down the rate of neurogenesis. They're also really bad for our blood vessels. And so they create heart disease, create strokes. It's a disaster for all systems in the body. So we want to get good, healthy fats. So things like avocados, nuts, pastured eggs are great. Grass-fed and pastured dairy, grass-fed beef, pastured chicken, wild-caught fish. And we also want to have lots of good non-carby vegetables, non-starchy vegetables. So broccoli, salads, jicama, sprouts, olive oil, cooking with things like ghee or butter or lard or coconut oil. Coconut oil is great. We don't ever want to cook with vegetable oil because that turns rancid, oxidizes immediately, and wreaks havoc in the whole system. There's also a number of supplements, and the book goes into about 25 or 30 different supplements that can dramatically increase our rate of neurogenesis. So one of these is a supplement called hesperidin. And hesperidin is a bioflavonoid found in citrus fruits. And we want about 500 to 1,000 milligrams a day of it. Now, most foods, when we eat them, because this whole field of neurogenesis is so recent, they don't know exactly how these different supplements enhance neurogenesis. Some of them enhance neurogenesis by increasing the rate at which new brain cells are formed. And some of them work by keeping new brain cells alive. So there are many things which will increase the rate of neurogenesis, but about half of those new brain cells die off pretty quickly. The brain prunes them pretty rapidly, unless we do certain other things. And one of those other things is hesperidin. Hesperidin keeps new brain cells alive. So if we're eating a low-carb, high good fat, moderate protein diet with lots of vegetables, fruits, low sugar fruits, and we're doing hesperidin, we're going to have a greatly increased rate of neurogenesis, and we're also going to have almost 100% survival of those new brain cells. So hesperidin is a really important one. And hesperidin, when you get most supplements of hesperidin, it generally isn't very bioavailable. The most bioavailable form is something called methylchalcone. Methylchalcone is something like 8 times more bioavailable than regular hesperidin. So that is something we really want. Another thing is curcumin, which is in curry spice. It's what makes it yellow. Curcumin is incredibly powerful as a stimulant of neurogenesis. It's also a big antioxidant, a big anti-inflammatory, and it also is not very bioavailable unless we do it with other things. So if you do your curcumin with phospholipids, for example, egg yolks or lecithin. It'll enhance the bioavailability like 5 times. Or if you do it micronized, there are some versions of curcumin you can get that are made into very small particles. That also increases the bioavailability like 5 to 8 times.
Wow.
And also something called piperine, which is a pepper extract, also increases the bioavailability of it. And it's a very cheap supplement that you can get along with curcumin. And the book goes into many other supplements that are helpful.
Yeah, those are great just off the bat. I mean, wow. And then the next thing I want to talk about was more movement. This is probably something that we don't think of as often. So maybe talk a little bit more about how movement affects neurogenesis.
Yeah, that's really important because it turns out that although all exercise is good for us, yoga, weightlifting, high intensity movement, high intensity interval training, aerobic exercise, it turns out that in terms of neurogenesis, there's only one kind of exercise that's really helpful, and that's aerobic exercise, sustained aerobic exercise. Yoga is great for lots of things, but it doesn't help in terms of neurogenesis. Same with weightlifting, and same with high intensity interval training. It's great for a lot of things, but it has almost no effect on neurogenesis. So aerobic exercise is anything that gets your heart beating quickly and gets you breathing fast. Aerobic means living on air. So running, jogging, biking, fast dancing, fast walking, hiking up a mountain, just walking quickly. Anything that gets your heart beating quickly. If you can do that for 30 minutes, 30, 40 minutes, 3 or 4 times a week, your brain will just start exploding with new neurons. Now, again, about half of those new neurons will die off pretty quickly unless you do other things, such as methylchalcone or hesperidin. Or another thing you can do is walk to new places, go to new neighborhoods, bike into new areas where you haven't been before. So new environments also keep new brain cells alive. So travel, going to new parts of the city. This also has a powerful effect on neurogenesis in terms of keeping new brain cells alive.
Wow. Yeah, I did not know that one. That's incredible. Incredible. And does this go into kind of that same rule kind of neurology of like nerves wire the way they fire? So is it better to constantly be changing the way they fire so that way you can keep developing those new circuit and pathways?
Exactly. So there's the chapter on the mind in the book goes into, well, what is the kind of best mental stimulation we can do to increase neurogenesis? So neurogenesis is increased when the brain is stimulated, when we are learning new things. The question is, what kind of new things? So it turns out that just about all of the brain games, all of the computer brain games, all of the crossword puzzles, all that stuff, it's not very effective when it comes to neurogenesis because it doesn't generalize. What doing crosswords does, or doing a particular computer game does, it makes you better at that computer game, or it makes you better at doing crosswords, but it doesn't generalize across the brain. So we need to learn constantly new things. We need to become lifelong learners. That is the key. So just do something new. Take a cooking class. Learn a new musical instrument. Try taking a class in something you've always been interested in but have never done. Read a book in a new topic. Writing also stimulates the brain. write, whether it's just email, whether it's in a journal. Writing is very helpful for stimulating the brain. And it also, when we stimulate our brain like this, it builds up what's called cognitive reserve, which protects us from Alzheimer's. So it turns out that there are 2 times in life when there is a noticeable and measurable cognitive decline. The first time is when people graduate from college, and the second time is when they retire. Unless, after you graduate from college, you go into a profession where you have to use your mind. Or unless, after you retire, you then do something where you stimulate your mind. Then there is no cognitive fall off. Professions like teaching, professions, medicine, lawyers, business people who have involved a lot of complexity, there is no cognitive decline. There's actually an increase in certain cognitive capacities. The brain actually doesn't fully mature in certain areas until actually our 50s. Certain kinds of impulse control, certain capacities around empathy don't really peak until our 50s or even 60s. So this idea that we are at our peak in our early 20s and then it's a slow decline, that's only true for certain kinds of physical capacities and certain kinds of short-term memory. Other kinds of neurological processes actually take much longer to mature. So it's important to keep our brain healthy throughout our entire lifespan in this, to be working our brain, to be kind of cross-training the brain physically, with exercise, with other physical things that the book goes into, diet, in terms of eating well and avoiding things that are bad, emotionally, mentally, and also spiritually. Turns out there are 2 different kinds of spiritual practices which have a very profound effect on our rate of neurogenesis. So all of these working together are much better than just one working alone.
Can you talk about the 2 types of spiritual practices?
Yeah. So it appears as if mindfulness practice has a very robust effect on neurogenesis on the entire hippocampus. That is, on the entire axis of it. Mindfulness practice, as no doubt you know, and probably many of your listeners know, is a process of coming into the here and now, coming into the present. And there's many different ways of doing it. One most common way, the kind that's most often taught, is by focusing on our breathing. Just the sensations of the breath coming into our belly and leaving. And the idea is to just passively let all other thoughts go, passively ignore other thoughts, and just tune into the body sensations of the breath. There's other mindfulness practices where you just become aware of everything and simply watch it, simply observe it. You just come into bare attention and just watch thoughts, watch your feelings, notice your sensations. And what happens in all different forms of mindfulness practice is that, first of all, we become aware of just how out of control our mind is, how noisy it is, but then it begins to settle down. The dust begins to settle, and we begin to wake up. We begin to come into the now more and more. So all different kinds of mindfulness practice have a very profound effect on neurogenesis along the entire hippocampus. The other form of spiritual practice are different kinds of heart-opening practices. So devotion practices, compassion practices, different kinds of bhakti practices, love practices. So the different theistic traditions here, Christianity, Judaism, Islam, the bhakti traditions of India, all of these focus on opening the heart. And there's many different ways to do this also. One is by focusing on a feeling of love for the divine, and we grow into increasing feelings of love, from impure to increasingly pure forms of love and devotion. Another is to focus in the heart area and just aspire to the divine. Another is different compassion practices in Buddhism, of just having compassion for ourselves and then extending that compassion out to the whole world. All of these practices are very, very helpful at also extending the entire length of the hippocampus and having a very powerful effect on the rate of neurogenesis.
Wow. And this is kind of going off topic a little bit, but what does things like television, like electronics, cell phones, what kind of effect does that have on neurogenesis?
That's a very interesting question, and I think it's somewhat complicated. Clearly, too much TV watching, too much time at the computer slows down the rate of neurogenesis. No question about that. On the other hand, the brain is stimulated by, and neurogenesis is stimulated by different kinds of visual stimulation and auditory stimulation also. So one of the worst things for neurogenesis is no stimulation at all. Like if you just imagine lying in a hospital bed or being in an old folks' home, just in a room by yourself. Or I suppose the worst would be solitary confinement in a prison. No interpersonal stimulation, no intellectual stimulation, no emotional stimulation, very little physical stimulation. Visually, no stimulation. Neurogenesis slows to a crawl. Rates of anxiety and depression shoot way up. Cognitive decline accelerates. It's a disaster for the brain. The brain thrives on stimulation, but it needs to be optimal stimulation. It's kind of like getting to this Goldilocks zone. Too much stimulation and it becomes stressful, which slows down the rate of neurogenesis. Too little and the rate of neurogenesis also slows down. So we need an optimal amount of brain stimulation. And time on the internet, a little bit can be helpful to that, but most of us get way too much of it. Most of us would be much better off actually spending time with our friends, actually taking a walk in the woods, than just spending time in front of the computer.
And kind of a great segue from that, you talked about stress a little bit. What role does stress play in that neurogenesis as well?
Yeah, good. So here again, it's this Goldilocks zone. So we think of stress as bad, and for most people it is. But it turns out that stress is, in small amounts, is actually good. When we work out, when we do exercise, what we're doing is we're stressing our muscles. Okay. When we stress our muscles and then stop, the muscle breaks down and then it builds up stronger again. If we were to just continue exercising and not stopping, the muscle would just break down. It would be a disaster. It's the same with regular stress. Optimal stress is low to moderate, and it's short term. Low to moderate stress, that is time limited, calls forth new capacities from us. It makes us bring forth new abilities that we didn't know we had. And it stimulates neurogenesis. But the idea then is that afterwards, the stress ends and we return to a homeostatic balance. That's optimal stress. But that's not the kind of stress in most people's lives. Most people have chronic stress, or they have high levels of stress. And that is a disaster for the brain. it again slows neurogenesis way, way down. And it's a precursor to anxiety, and it's a precursor to depression. They do animal models of depression. And the way they create them is they just chronically stress them. After a while, the animal just becomes depressed. It's just too much. We are seeing sky-high levels of depression in our society, sky-high levels of stress. It's really important for anybody to have some way to de-stress, to turn off, to decompress, whether it's with exercise, whether it's a walk in the woods, whether it's a good time with your friends, whether it's just relaxing with a good book, with music. We need to just shut down the stimulation and just chill. That for the body to come back to a homeostatic balance is hugely important for everybody. So chronic stress, which is also implicated in heart disease, in diabetes, in inflammation, in all sorts of physical diseases, it's also a disaster for the brain and the brain's function as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And it even has physical manifestations beyond that as well, too, which is just, we're seeing skyrocketing rates of that as well, too. What are some of your most helpful habits and things that you've seen to get people out of stress as quickly as possible? And you kind of mentioned a few.
Well, one is I ask how much coffee they drink. Many people are just strung out on coffee, and caffeine is one of these things that is it's double-edged when it comes to the brain. Caffeine, over the short term, increases short-term memory and recall, and you can get work done. But over the long term, it decreases the rate of neurogenesis. It slows your rate of neurogenesis way down. And also, it's a vasoconstrictor. And so the capillaries in the brain get small, and we want more blood in the brain, not less. So people who are strung out on caffeine, just stopping coffee, just stopping caffeine can, I see many patients who come in with anxiety, chronic stress, and just stopping caffeine is often a big help in their process. They often go through a little dip where they the body has to learn how to wake itself up again. But then after a week or two, they're fine. Another thing is exercise of any kind. Yoga, strength training, aerobic, high-intensity workout, anything. It gets your body going, and then you relax. You come back to a baseline. I think another thing is, again, I look at diet, and so high sugar, high carbohydrate diets produce inflammation, produce insulin resistance, lower rates of neurogenesis, and also make it harder to deal with anxiety, harder to deal with emotion regulation. So just making sure people are getting enough fats, finding things people just love to do, just for the sake of doing it, whether it's walking in the woods, whether it's just hanging out with friends, something where they just feel like they can let their hair down, just be themselves.
I think it's really interesting to come across this type of method, and really it's much more of a perspective for the future. And I think I personally think that this is going to be the next wave of healthcare for the future, is really focusing on brain development. Because in my mind, it seems like you think very similarly, that if we can't take control of our brain and we don't have a healthy brain, it makes it much more difficult to manage our emotions, makes it much more difficult to manage our stress. And these things are only getting more and more challenging, especially in the future. We get more technology, more stress. So I think the neurogenesis model seems to fit pretty well in line with kind of where health is going in the future. Would you agree?
Absolutely. Yeah, I'm totally with you on that.
Yeah, 100% agree. And have you, and this may be a little off topic, have you done any research into nootropics or anything like that? I know that's a new budding area of kind of research now.
Um, the book only goes into natural things.
Mm-hmm.
So there are a number of nootropics which are natural. Curcumin, for example, blueberries and blueberry extract, powerful effect on increasing neurogenesis. But I stayed away from the synthetic nootropics, mostly because for many people, I find they're not helpful. They make me feel just kind of weird. I mean, I may have better cognitive capacity, but I feel kind of disconnected and emotionally out of touch, it puts me in tenebo. Just I feel weird. So I've stayed away from that personally. Some people can do them and say they feel great, but the book just goes into natural things.
Yeah, and it's been interesting. I've noticed people who have spoken out on nootropics before. Many of them do agree that you can get a lot of the same effects of nootropics by your lifestyle alone. And a lot of them have said, yes, it helped in the short time, but once I started taking care of my diet, started taking care of my lifestyle, exercising properly, you really do notice there's a similar effect without the need for using synthetic materials or compounds as well too. So I find that very fascinating as well, that we've kind of reached this new state where we still want to get rich quick, but now it's kind of like, all right, let's go back to what works for the body naturally. And I think that's going to be the next wave for the future as well too. Mm-hmm. And what does health is wealth mean to you?
Health is wealth. That's an interesting question. It just seems like health is the basis of everything. If our body and our brain isn't healthy, everything is messed up. If that's healthy, if our brain is functioning at a high level, and most people I think are operating about 70, 80% of what's possible, increasing your rate of neurogenesis, increasing the health of the body, increasing the brain's actual potential to come up to closer to 100%, you just feel good. You feel really good. When bad things happen, which they inevitably do, you bounce back. There's this resilience. That's what resilience means. It's the capacity to bounce back when bad things happen. So you feel not exactly like Superman, but you feel like you bring so much more internal resource to everything, so that life becomes joyful. It becomes a lot of fun. It becomes enjoyable. If you don't have health, everything is a struggle. It's like paddling uphill or paddling upstream. It's just hard. If you've got health, if you've got high level of brain health, it's like paddling downstream. Life is a pleasure at that point.
And one question we got from our viewer audience was, for people who say created bad habits within their brain, created bad habits in the way they think, is it possible through the neurogenesis model to possibly rewire some of those bad habits?
Absolutely. One thing that's really become clear in neuroscience research over the last decade is just how malleable and flexible the brain is. So we've known about neuroplasticity for a few decades, how the brain is always making new connections. Neurogenesis, we've just discovered really in the past decade and a half. So we're not only creating new connections, we're making new brain cells. And a habit is just something that you are used to. To create a new habit takes conscious thought and intention. But after a few months of, say, a new diet, that becomes easy. You don't even think about it anymore. After eating well, it's like our dietary habits are just habits. When you eat in a new way for 2 or 3 months, that becomes normal. And eating a low carb, for most people, some people can do high carb, but most people are insulin resistant. 80%, they figure, in America right now has some degree of insulin resistance, which is increasingly being talked about as carbohydrate intolerance. And so in the same way as we deal with gluten intolerance by not eating gluten, or lactose intolerance by not eating lactose, we deal with carbohydrate intolerance by reducing carbohydrates. That's hard at first, but then it becomes easy. In fact, it becomes really enjoyable.
And to me, it seems like the neurogenesis model is much more, we talked about your brain wires the way it fires. It seems like if you want to help your brain rewire and create those new circuit pathways, it's going to need resources also to help that. And the neurogenesis model seems to be providing that resource to pave those new pathways, it seems like. Would you agree?
Absolutely. That's absolutely right. Yes.
Yeah. And another viewer question we had was, what effect do grains and things like gluten have on neurogenesis?
Okay, so grains and all carbohydrates eventually turn into sugar. And high levels of sugar decrease our rate of neurogenesis. They also eventually create insulin resistance, which also slows the rate of neurogenesis. So I think one of the most important dietary things for most people is to increase your insulin sensitivity. If we're insulin resistant, that means that there is a higher level of glucose in our bloodstream, which is damaging to every cell in the body, and high levels of insulin, which is also damaging to every organ of the body. It turns out that cognitive decline and insulin resistance go hand in hand. You can track them just about exactly. So an important test for anybody to do is hemoglobin A1C. And that measures your blood glucose over the past 3 months. So anything over 5.0, they say that 5.4 is healthy and normal, but no, your rate of cognitive decline increases for every 0.1 increase in your hemoglobin A1C, your rate of cognitive decline accelerates. So it's a good test for everybody to do. And even though most doctors will say, if it's below 5.8, you're fine, that's not the case. You want to get it way down. And so most people would be well advised to decrease carbs. And that means for most people cutting out grains, because gliadin increases gut permeability in everybody, even if they're not gluten sensitive. Some people seem to do grains fine, but increasingly it looks like it's just going to be part of the whole carbohydrate intolerance that gets built.
Especially in the United States as well, too, which is just the way we process everything as well, too.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for being on the show. I had such a great time with you. This was a fantastic interview, and I'm just so happy to have you on. And thanks again.
Thank you for having me. I really appreciate this. I love your questions.
Thank you so much again for tuning into this episode with Dr. Brant Cortright. I hope you enjoyed this one as much as I did. And if you did like this one, feel free to do me a favor, head over to iTunes and leave us a rating and review. Let us know what you think about this episode, because guess what? That's how people find this podcast. That's how people get this valuable information, is from great reviews from people like you. So if you could do that, that would mean the world to us. And also, once again, if you weren't able to take notes on this one, forgot about one piece that we talked about, you can also head over to theneurolifestyle.com/Dr. Brant Cortright. And there we have tons of show notes on this one that you go ahead, check that out, and take all that information home with you. Thanks again for tuning in, and I will see you guys next time on The Neuro Lifestyle.